you quick over the last chapter, which is performance testing, something that we liked so much that we provided some WebDriver extensions for Source Labs. So you can not only run this locally, but also on Source. And I can show you an example how that works. In this case, we run our test locally and we just assert directly in that test. And we use Lighthouse, WebdriverIO uses Lighthouse under the hood, as well as we do on Source Labs. Here's one example how we run it locally and one on Source, because both are a little bit different. For local, we use, you will see that the setup uses the DevTools service, which is a service that allows you to interact with Google Lighthouse and the Chrome DevTools API. So you can find the service in here with some explanation how you integrate it and install it. But essentially, you install the service and add it to your service list. And then you have some additional commands to your availability. One is, for instance, to emulate an iPhone X. And here you don't need to remember the resolutions anymore. In this case, WebdriverIO knows what the resolution is of an iPhone X and changes the resolution to that. And then it calls enable performance audits. And here you can define your your network throttling capabilities and your CPU throttling capabilities. I would suggest to have something like a good 3G and 4 times to emulate the mobile device. Because if you run performance test on a supercomputer, your results would be not really like test a user that would struggle with the performance of your website. So that's why it's always recommended, and that's why Lighthouse usually runs those performance tests on mobile emulated environment. And so here you can do that with those commands as well. Then you open the page, and then you can call use the get metrics command to assert against certain metrics that you return. This is essentially the same as you would go on. You would go in your DevTools and would pick Lighthouse tab and you create a report. The advantage here is that if you continue going to different pages, like opening different URLs, WebdriverIO will always take the performance of the pages that you open. So let's say we transition, once we have opened the feed page, we transition to a different page. You would be able to, again, get the metrics for that consecutive page load. And this is really useful if you want to make sure, for instance, that your cache, kicks in, that your consecutive page load is much faster. You can test how your website performs if you, have an offline experience. Things like that are possible. And even if you, submit the form and then you submit on the button, that page transition also is being captured and you can assert against it. As opposed to just checking for a specific URL, you can integrate this into your flow. That being said, your performance test should be always come after your functional test. You should not mix them together. Otherwise, you will get results and have to figure out if this problem now comes from a performance test or from a functional test. And it's always better to run both in separate steps. So first your unit test, then your integration test, then your end-to-end test. And then at the end, you have things like performance testing and other things that you might like to add. Maybe accessibility testing, things like that. Integrating this into WebdriverIO, you can, this will be automatically propagated to the reporters that WebdriverIO provides. There are no special reporters to it. It's like treating it like any other test. If you like to have special reports on performance test, I recommend to run it on Source on a consecutive level, because then Source Labs can store your performance results over time and can give you like a trend of how your page performance has evolved over time. So that's the advantage of running things like that in the cloud, is that we can store this over time and then we can give you a report that shows, this behavior over time. So I guess you can see it from this YouTube video where you can see that we capture performances over time and we create some sort of baseline where we check, okay, we understand how your page performance works and how it goes over time. And so according to a recent page load, we don't want to see your page loading slower than a specific threshold. Because even though we run the test in the same environment, given all these network flakes that you can have on the internet at all times, you will never receive the same performance of your page load at all times, every time again. Which is why we create some sort of baseline where we say, okay, we expect your page load to be between 2.2 and 2.7 seconds. And not only the page load, but all the metrics that we have. And yeah, that's what I see as advantage for running this in the cloud. And in fact, I created a NPM tool that helps you there if you want to get started with it really easily. It's called Speedo, and it allows you to test your application, to run Lighthouse in the cloud, essentially. So you pass in an URL, and we run the performance test for that specific page load 10 times in parallel, and then we check what's the average performance score is, what's the average like first paint metric is, and then we allow you to assert against certain of these metrics and compare the baselines with each other. So this is really, if you're really interested in like just having one tool to test the performance of one specific page load, you can do that. You can also use Speedo for multiple page load that happens during one functional test. There's also functionality for that. If you have like a specific performance test that you run, where you have a flow like going on a page, submitting a form, and then delete the session, you can use Speedo to actually test against those two page transitions that happen during the test. And important here is that you provide the extended debugging and capture performance source options, but more on that is in the documentation page here I can share.